Right now, somewhere in the ocean, a ship carrying your phone, your shoes, or your food is passing through one tiny stretch of water. That stretch of water is controlled by one tiny island, and almost nobody outside of shipping and finance knows its name. This is the story of Singapore, the island city-state that quietly became the center of the world. Singapore is smaller than London. It has no natural resources, no oil, no rivers, and almost no farmland. It even has to import most of its drinking water. And yet Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries on earth per person. Its port is one of the busiest on the planet, second only to Shanghai. Every single day, over 1,000 ships pass through the Strait of Malacca just beside it. The Strait of Malacca connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. This means it connects Europe and the Middle East to China and Japan. About 40% of all global trade passes through this one narrow channel every year. To put that in perspective, that is more than $5 trillion worth of goods every single year. But Singapore was not always powerful. In 1819, it was a small fishing village with a population of about 1,000 people. Then a British officer named Stamford Raffles arrived. Raffles immediately understood something that nobody else had fully realized. This island sat at the exact crossroads of every major trade route between East and West. Raffles declared Singapore a free port, meaning any ship could trade there with zero taxes. Within 3 years, the population exploded from 1,000 to 10,000 people. Merchants from China, India, Arabia, and Europe all flooded in. Singapore became the most diverse trading hub in Asia almost overnight. The British controlled Singapore for over a century and built the infrastructure that made it a powerhouse. Then in 1942, something happened that shook the entire British Empire. Japan captured Singapore in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster in British military history. Over 80,000 British and Allied troops surrendered, the largest surrender in British history. After World War II, Britain returned to Singapore, but its grip on the region was never the same. In 1965, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia, not voluntarily. They were expelled, the only country in modern history to gain independence against its will. The leader of Singapore at the time, Lee Kuan Yew, cried on national television. He said Singapore had no chance of survival on its own. No resources, no military, no food security. Surrounded by much larger and sometimes hostile neighbors. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in modern economic history. Lee Kuan Yew made a decision that most leaders would never dare to make. Instead of trying to compete with its neighbors on cheap labor or natural resources, Singapore would compete on something else entirely. Singapore would become the most reliable, efficient, and corruption-free place in Asia to do business. Lee Kuan Yew invested massively in education, infrastructure, and fighting corruption. He built one of the most efficient ports in the world, where ships could load, unload, and refuel faster than anywhere else. Global companies realized that if they needed their goods to move between East and West, Singapore was the answer. Multinational corporations began setting up their Asian headquarters in Singapore. Banks, oil traders, tech firms, shipping companies, all of them planted flags in Singapore. By the 1990s, Singapore had one of the highest standards of living in Asia, from a tiny fishing village with no resources to a global financial and trading hub in just 30 years. But Singapore's real power is not just its port. Singapore controls the price of oil for much of Asia. The Singapore Exchange sets benchmark prices for oil that ripple across the entire Asian market. Singapore is also the world's largest ship refueling station. If every ship stopped refueling in Singapore tomorrow, global shipping would be thrown into chaos. Singapore also handles most of the world's rubber, tin, and electronics trade in Asia. About half the world's supply of semiconductors passes through Singapore every year. Your laptop, your phone, your car's electronics, they probably pass through Singapore. Now here is where Singapore's story gets truly strange. Singapore is technically a democracy, but has been ruled by the same political party since 1959. It scores high on freedom and quality of life surveys, but low on press freedom rankings. Chewing gum was banned for years because it was dirtying the MRT stations. Fines in Singapore are legendary. Littering, jaywalking, and even not flushing a public toilet can cost you hundreds of dollars. And yet people keep moving there because it works. Singapore has one of the highest concentrations of millionaires per capita in the entire world. 1 in 6 households in Singapore is a millionaire household. But there is a darker side to Singapore's success that rarely gets talked about. Housing is extremely expensive and inequality is growing rapidly. Foreign workers who build Singapore's gleaming infrastructure often live in cramped dormitories with almost no rights. The same port that makes Singapore rich also makes it a target. Piracy in the Strait of Malacca was one of the most serious maritime threats in the world just 20 years ago. Singapore worked with neighboring countries to reduce piracy by over 80%. Singapore also faces an existential threat that money cannot easily solve. Climate change and rising sea levels threaten to swallow parts of Singapore within this century. Singapore is spending billions to build seawalls, reclaim land from the ocean, and climate-proof its infrastructure. And it is also reclaiming land from the sea. Singapore today is 25% larger than it was in 1965. It is literally building itself bigger to survive. There is also the question of what happens if the Strait of Malacca becomes irrelevant. China has been building alternative shipping routes and infrastructure projects that could bypass Singapore entirely. Singapore knows it cannot be complacent. Even the most powerful positions in history can be lost. That is why Singapore is now investing heavily in becoming a global hub for finance, tech, and artificial intelligence. It wants to make sure that even if ships find new routes, Singapore remains the place the world cannot ignore. The story of Singapore is really the story of what happens when geography meets vision, a tiny island with nothing that turned its location into everything. Next time you buy something that says Made in Asia, there is a good chance Singapore had something to do with getting it to you. The most powerful place in global trade is not New York, it is not London, it is not Beijing. It is a tiny island at the tip of a peninsula that most people could not find on a map. And that tiny island handles more of what you own, what you eat, and what you use than any country 10 times its size.